So today, as we kick off our Lunch and Learn series for the year, we've got Melinda Wilson. Melinda is going to be visiting with us today about perennials versus annuals. So Melinda, we appreciate you doing this today.
Welcome all y'all. Good y'all all came out. When we're planting our gardens, we think about what we're going to plant in there. And do we know the difference between annuals and perennials? While they both bring beauty to the garden, their differences are significant. So you'll want to educate, or I'm going to try to educate you about it. Okay, I'm going to give it a thing. Now let's just think about, what's your favorite flower? Just think, okay.
Sunflower.
Sunflower? What do you like about it? The beauty, the color, the scent? So, anyone else have a flavor?
Iris.
An iris? That's one of my favorites. I love the iris. They have a good scent usually, and I like the beauty of it. It's one of God's masterpieces to me. It's just
I like the bulbs.
yes.
Well, I guess I like the roses. I'm kind of stupid.
Well, and see, a rose smells good and it's beautiful. Another one of God's handiworks.
I like any of them if they're purple.
The what? The purple?
I like any of them if they're purple.
In purple flowers. And some people are like that. They'll plant their yard all yellow flowers, all red flowers.
Oh, I'm a mixture.
That they have a liking for a color. That's what they're going to go with. Okay. An annual flower is one that you plant the seed and it grows, it produces the flower, and then at the end of its growth cycle it dies. You have to replant it every year because they could get expensive if you have to keep replanting. Perennials, again, you plant them, they're dormant in the winter months, but then they come back in the spring and the blooms last 2 to 6 weeks. And they're best planted in the spring and the fall, and they can be planted 6 weeks before the ground freezes, and then they overwinter. And then there's the biennial, which kind of throws a monkey wrench into everything. You plant them, and the first year they just grow foliage, and you have to wait for the second year. They'll die back usually, and then the second year they'll grow and flower, and then after they flower and put on seed, they die. So you have to start that cycle all over again. So an annual is a short-lived plant. The entire life cycle is completed in one season. A biennial takes 2 seasons to complete its cycle. That's like a foxglove or hollyhock. A perennial, they'll live from year to year, and they can be woody or herbaceous. And again, like that's just a chart showing you how they germinate till they die, their cycles. What exactly are perennials? Technically speaking, a perennial is any plant that grows for more than one season without having to be replanted. In fact, they are typically grown and returned every year for about 3 to 5 years. There are 2 types of perennials. You have your hardy perennials and your tender perennials. And the hardy, they will survive the harshest winters. But like your tender perennials, sometimes, I think of a plumeria. Here we grow it in a container, and you have to put it in the garden, a greenhouse, or bring it indoors during the winter. Down south of us, around Galveston in that area, they grow them year-round and outdoors. So you have different types of perennials with short-lived that last 2 to 3 years. There's long-lived that live 5 years or more. Herbaceous, they have the soft green stems, and they die back to the ground each winter in the colder zones, like a salvia. And then you have woody types. They'll lose their leaves in the fall, but the root system stays alive. There's different types of perennials, but there's one that's going to fit your need just about anywhere. Any kind you want. There's some that are known for their foliage. the color, the size, and the location, whether you want it in sun or full sun. There's perennials that will fit that either type. And the soil. And I'm not going to, I mean, you can get variegated foliage, different colors of foliage and perennials. You think about like pampas grass. Choose perennials that bloom colored white flowers to almost black in the colors. You have a great variety of color even in the perennials, but not as much as you do in annuals. The size, they can grow big or small, but perennials do multiply, so when you're planting them, you know, just remember to give them enough space, or you'll have to divide them and cut them back quite a bit. Location, we talked about full sun or shade, whichever you need. And they prefer well-drained soil. And there's just a list of some of the most popular perennials. Are any of those your favorites up there? See, I just, you know, I love the Russian sage. I love sages and salvias, so I have a lot of those in my yard. Coreopsis is always a good one for bright yellow color.
I love peonies, but I'm not having any luck down here really.
Oh, no.
No, our winters aren't cold enough, and we get too hot.
I like that. Lily, no.
Annual plants are those that only live for one growing season. You plant them in the garden as seeds or small plants, bedding plants, and they grow, bloom, seed, and die, all in one season. You have hardy annuals. They do well in cooler weather, and they're able to withstand some of the freezing temperatures, and they can be planted early. These types will also do well when planted in the fall when the temperatures begin to fall. Hardy and half-hardy annuals, they tolerate a touch of frost, and most common annuals fall into this category. If a surprise spring frost arrives, be prepared to cover them at night, or you'll be going back to the nursery. Tender annuals, they can't take frost, and most have originated in the tropics or subtropic climates. Their growth may be stunted in cooler weather, which is above freezing, and they shouldn't be planted until late spring. Some of the favorite annuals are there's a whole bunch of annuals, but I just kind of picked out. One of my favorite annuals is sweet potato vine, and it will sometimes overwinter and come back out the next year, and you have more sweet potato vine than you ever wanted.
Unless the deer eat it.
Unless the deer eat it.
Up underneath your carport.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, they're brave. Yeah, that's and poppies. I love poppies, but I'm not real successful growing those. What are biennial plants? They only live, like I said, for the they have a 2-year growing season. Biennials have foliage growth only their first year, no flowers. The flowering occurs the second growing season, and then that plant will set seed and die. But most biennials do reseed themselves and will drop seeds, and then they'll come up the next year. Some biennial favorites: foxgloves, hollyhock, lupine, which is like bluebonnets, forget-me-nots, and dianthus. And I think some of your wildflowers are biennial. Quite a few of them are biennial, I believe. Okay, pop quiz time.
They've had much success with the hollyhock in this area. I've never had any luck growing a hollyhock.
No, because I think they're another one that gets too hot.
Okay.
That's kind of like the foxglove too. It does good in the early spring, but then once it gets hot, it just dies.
Okay.
Okay, pop quiz time. What flowers come back year after year? Do you have to replant annuals every year?
Yes.
Okay. Some other things to consider when you're choosing whether you're going to plant annuals or perennials? Do you want a super low maintenance garden? Do you want to replant your favorite flowers every year? Do you need to be frugal on how much money you spend on seeds and small plants? You don't go to the nursery with your husband. Secret there. Do you enjoy tending to your gardens, pruning, deadheading, fertilizing? If a low maintenance garden is what you're looking for, opt for perennials. They're low maintenance and they sprout back year after year. Since you can grow up to 5, then they can grow up to 5 growing seasons. You're getting more bang for your buck. Crave rich color, texture, blooms, go for the annuals. Annuals can bloom throughout the spring, summer, and even fall. Then annuals are for you. Want a perennial only garden? Then plant perennials that have different blooming times. This will help ensure that you have blooms and foliage in your garden for several seasons out of the year. Want fast results? Go for the annuals. They give you that. Usually they're blooming when you buy them as bedding plants, but they are one-shot plants. Just remember that. They will die at the end of the season, and you will have to start all over the following year. Do I want to grow plants from seed or buy them already in bloom? If you have more time than money, starting plants from seeds is a great way to get more flowers for less cash. Or if you procrastinate and you wait too late to plant those seeds, then you go buy the plants. Sometimes you want to get a plant to cover a bare space fast. You want to fill up a container or just put some color in your life. That's when the bedding plants are your best option. And they're also good, like if you're planting perennials and you have bare spots between them, those annuals will fill in until those perennials get big enough to cover those spots. How do you care for your annuals? You deadhead, remove the old flowers. Make sure your annuals in the ground get at least 1 inch of water per week. And they'll look greener if you add a little compost by side dressing them in rows or applying a balanced fertilizer. Some annuals will grow over the course of the summer like wave petunias, but blooms can get sparse after the initial show, and as our summer heat in Texas here just heats up things, so a lot of times that'll shut down the blooming. Some annuals do best in cool weather. They're called hardy annuals. They're tough enough to stand near freezing temperatures in the spring, but once the weather gets hot, they may stop flowering and turn brown. An example is like pansies or snapdragons, which we plant those this time of the year so that we have that color in our gardens now. And you may want to replace those then in the early spring with geraniums, marigolds, or zinnias. You've got a lot of shade, and usually your problem is if you have shade, you can't have flowers because flowers need sun. So think about things that don't need as much sun, like caladiums, begonias, and coleus. They have the color, but they don't really actually flower. It's in their leaves. Some good annuals for Texas are begonia, caladiums, coleus, that list. I just kind of did a little collage of some of the flowers. So if you had that combination, your garden would really be colorful. Perennials, again, they are a commitment that pays off. They survive year-round. Once you plant them, you can look forward to seeing them bloom year after year. The downside is they usually only bloom in short periods because they need the energy to put into the roots. Well, they bloom all summer and then they put the energy into the roots during the winter. The perennials usually do better planted directly into your flower garden than in a container, simply because in the container, if it gets below freezing, those roots are exposed to that cold temperature and they don't do that. They can't take that. The best way to care for a perennial plant is to choose plants that are adapted for your conditions. If your site is hot and dry, look for drought-tolerant plants like yarrow, I can't say the agastache, which is the, looks like a snapdragon, and penstemon. If it's damp, you'll have better luck with plants like Louisiana iris. There are some shade-tolerant perennials such as corbels and perennial geraniums. Why do you need both annuals and perennials? Annuals will give you that pop of color 12 months out of the year. Investing in perennials, though, saves money. Perennials save on water, too. The maintenance is the same for both annuals and perennials. Both need deadheading and trimming. Any plant we plant in our garden or yard, it's going to need some attention. You can't just put it there and say, go to work, Joe. Okay. Using both annuals and perennials in your garden will give you variety in your garden. And yet you can substitute some. You have annuals and you want something that's more permanent, so you want to get a perennial that's compatible with it. Go for coreopsis instead of the marigolds, and they'll come back year after year. Penstemon and snapdragons, versus the snapdragons. I love my snapdragons, but once they bloom and it gets hot, they're gone. I have had the penstemon, and then it's also some what they call a false snapdragon. I think false kind of grows on a spike like that too, and it does well. Heliopsis. I'm not real good at some of these names. And sunflowers. I love sunflowers, but again, they're an annual, whereas the other comes back. It's not as tall, but it provides that yellow color. A blanket flower versus the annual gazania. Japanese. No, how do you say that? No. And the cosmos. Perennial dianthesis versus annual dianthesis. Perennial salvias versus annual salvias. Delphiniums in place of larkspur. Perennial and annual asters. Coneflowers, zinnias. And just for fun, there's a whole bunch of herbs that fit in, that are perennials, biennials, and I thought that was just fun to see which ones that you could grow and that would come year after year. You wouldn't have to replant versus the others that you have to plant every year. And this is the time of the year to plant cilantro. If you can find the plants, start looking for them, because once it gets hot, cilantro doesn't do well. It'll bolt to go to seed. So, what are some of the pros and cons of growing annuals? They're quick bloomers, provide quick harvest. They come in a multitude of colors. Annual plants, they're not expensive. And many types of the annuals, they self-seed. Annuals are easy to grow. And most vegetables are annuals. And they can be quickly established and improve bare land. Some of the bad things about them, you got to replant them every year. And then that can add up to some cost year after year. Most annual plants, they cannot take the cold. Annuals tend to require more frequent watering, and insects attack them more often. And they require more maintenance for continual blooms, because you continually have to deadhead them to keep them blooming. Pros and cons of biennials. The pros are they provide a quick harvest. The second year provides the harvest and the blooms. And several common vegetables are biennial plants, like asparagus. And as I was doing my research, like a carrot is a biennial. If you leave that carrot in the ground, the second year it will produce flowers and seeds. And that's where they get their seeds. And broccoli, cabbage, they said, if you don't harvest the crop, it goes to seed, but it's the second year that it really makes the seed. You can quickly establish and improve bare land with biennials. The bad things, cons, they have to be replanted every year to ensure that you keep having a harvest each year. and they require more watering than established perennial plants. And the second year harvest may be tough and less enjoyable than the first year harvest. So if you waited for that carrot 2 years, it's not going to be you have to get an axe to cut it up. Pros and cons of perennials. They're a good long-term investment. I'm big on perennials because once you plant it, it's usually there for a while. You're not going back to the nursery and replanting it. And they multiply, so you can divide them and put them somewhere else or give them to a friend. They provide harvest year after year without the replanting. Perennials, they propagate easy, don't they, David?
Yeah.
And perennials, they require less water once they're established. And there was much less work with, they're a lot less time consuming than your annuals and your biennials. And they can help build your soil. Native perennials create welcoming habitat for pollinators and wildlife. I have several in my yard that the hummingbirds love. So I don't put out hummingbird feeders at my house. They just come to the flowers. So. The cons, perennials, they're short blooming periods. They bloom. I take my salvias, they'll bloom, but if I trim them back, they grow new blooms. So it's just having to be consistent with them, and they'll keep blooming all summer, but it's just having to work with them. They require more space than annuals because they spread out, and they're less flexible since you don't replant each year. I mean, you plant it there and it's kind of like, it grows pretty big. It's going to be hard to dig it up and move it somewhere else. But so you usually stop and think about, do I really want that there for 3 or 4 years? But it's just not, when you just get right down to it, what's important is how the plant performs in your garden. For some of you, annuals may be the answer, and for others, perennials. But just remember, you never have enough plants in your garden, so just have fun planting, enjoying the results of your labor. There's always one more plant to plant in my yard. I'll find a spot. I know Kim's going to do a program in March, I think it is, Kim, on hummingbirds. And they love a lot of the perennial type plants. They love salvia. I plant cypress vine, they love that. And coral vine with the little pink flowers on it. That was a plant I got from my grandmother. And the reason I dug it up from her yard was because the hummingbirds were always on it. And that they do feed the hummingbirds during the summer. And it's one of the last vines that will die. I mean, it takes a pretty good frost to kill it.
Which one, coral vine?
Yeah, the coral vine. And I love passion flowers also.
Gladiolus,
Yes.
annuals, or perennials? Are they both? Because I planted some.
I think that's a tricky, like a tulip is a tricky one, whether it can be, it may be a vine.
The first year I planted the bulbs, they put out foliage, no flower. The second year.
What did you say?
Gladiolus. The second year, they bloomed like crazy. The third year, green, no blooms. So I'm hoping this spring,
This
summer,
says
they'll.
it says gladiolus perennial on this list.
Okay. But it was like if they bloom this year, coming up, then they're one of these that blooms every other
That
year.
may be because they're biennial.
They're biennials. So I'm hoping they'll come back this year because they were absolutely gorgeous. All the ones I had were variegated. There was orange and yellow, there was blue and purple, there was
pretty.
red and yellow. I've got some pictures, but.
Yeah, most of your bulbs, they say, are perennials. Like I plant amaryllis. I mean, I grow them, I buy my bulbs this time of the year to bloom real pretty in the house at Christmas, or right after Christmas usually. I never time it right. And then when those die down this spring, I'll plant them out in my flower bed on the south side of the house, and they come back year after year. I've had good luck just putting them, even through the freeze last year, they came back.
I've got to put mine in the ground. Yeah, they bloom pretty in the house.
So, crinums, crinum, I think they're kind of like an amaryllis, they're a white flower, but they're a huge green plant, but their bulbs will get the size of a cantaloupe. I mean, they're huge. And I had them, and they just kind of overtook a bed. I got mad one day, and I says, Mike, I'm ready to dig them up and get it. He says, oh, good. He gets out there with the shovel, and he's like, you sure you want all these dug up? I said, yes, I want them gone. And then he says, well, what are you going to do with them? I said, I'm going to put a deal on Master Gardener's page and say, I've got crinum bulbs. Here's a picture of what they look like. You want them, I'll bring them to you. Yes, four. And they have a big, like a bulb or something on the bottom that they come back from. Y'all have any more questions? Go ahead.
Well, what you were just talking about, crinum?
Yeah.
Can you spell that, or close to how you spell it? I've never heard of that, so that's why.
C-R-I-U-M, I believe. After a while, I'll look it up on my phone and I'll give it for you.
You probably see them in lots of places.
Yeah, a lot of old homesteads, they'll just, they'll be out in the middle of a pasture. But they're about, the greenery will get about 2 foot tall.
Oh, wow.
And it kind of grows, you think it's an amaryllis, but it's got more greenery than an amaryllis. But it spikes up a flower like an amaryllis. And they kind of have a scent. The ones I had were white with like a pink throat.
Do they have a wide leaf?
Yes.
I bet I
A
call
big.
it something else, but I think I've seen what you're talking about.
Well, y'all have any more questions? David, do you have anything to add about propagating perennials?
I've got a question from Polly that I'll share with everybody whenever.
Okay.
when you get finished.
Go ahead.
I had a question from Polly about angel trumpets, propagating angel trumpets. I have a lot of angel trumpets, and I'm trying not to propagate them because it does require a certain amount of care to carry them over to the next year. They will freeze. If you have them in the ground and you hear a freeze is coming, you go to right at the ground surface and you cut it off. It's going to be big and beautiful and green, and it's going to kill you. You cut it off at the ground, and then you mulch it with about 4 to 6 inches of mulch, and it will generally come back the next year and grow. They grow very rapidly if the conditions are right. So once you're going to cut this angel trumpet down, I had one probably 2 times this size on the back porch. It had grown through the pot, so I couldn't take it in. I was going to ruin it by chopping all the roots off. So I started cutting it. The bigger stalks, to me, seem to do better when you cut them, and you cut them in about 8 to 12 inch lengths. You just start at the tree. You can start at the top if you want to. This is too small to propagate like I do. You could stick this in maybe dirt, and maybe it would work if you kept it inside away from the freeze. So you just start at the tree, and you come down and you find a place and you cut it, and you strip the leaves off. You come down another 8 to 12, you cut it, you come down, and then when you get down to the base, you cut it off the base, and then you take your limbs that you propagated. I would say no limb smaller than the size of your thumb. It's not, they don't generally propagate well in water. You take a bucket of water and you fill it. Say if you had a 5-gallon bucket or 2.5-gallon bucket, and this was your cutting, you would want the water to come up about 1/3 of the way in the bucket. And you can put as many cuttings in a bucket as you can get into a bucket. The one thing you have to remember, they have to be in a warm place that doesn't freeze. So in your house, mine reside over winter in the pump house. It's very well insulated and it has a freezer in there that runs, that puts off heat. You have to change the water out about once a week or they'll start getting slimy and they'll rot at the bottom and they'll peel off, so you'll lose them. And the more you have in a bucket, the more important it becomes to change that water out. It gets pretty slimy looking, you can tell. And then you'll see little white root things start, nodes coming along the base where they're in the water. And that's when you know you're got success. And if you have room, you can pot them anytime. Once the roots break through, just be careful when you pot them. I use that BM1 to pot most things in, which you get from Bobo's. One year I potted about 20 or 30 and kept them in the pump bag. It's easier to raise them in the buckets, and March or April when the last freeze is done, then you just pot them and put them out underneath the tree or whatever. Don't put them in the direct sun and they'll leaf out. And the same thing if you have Confederate rose. Same thing, Confederate rose is very easy to propagate too. Same way. I had a huge Confederate rose. One year, I always propagate some of the limbs, not all of the limbs. They will die back to the ground. Sometimes they will come back, sometimes they won't. And a lot of people say, mine froze and didn't come back. And I said, did you take a cutting before the freeze so you know you have one to replace it? No, I didn't. Every year when I hear freeze, I go out and I make me a few cuttings if I want a particular angel trumpet or Confederate rose. So just in case it doesn't come back, then I have one from the mother plant. So, but propagation is pretty easy on angel trumpets and Confederate roses. That answer your question, Polly?
Yes, sir.
Don't really concentrate on these limbs coming out, even though you may have one that you think's thick enough. If you got enough of this thickness, a thumb or bigger, that's what you need to concentrate on. When you get up to the limbs, they're really not worth trying to, because once you strip them down, you have a very small surface for it to root on.
What was the BM's? Was that?
BM1. It's a real, yeah. You get it at Bobo's. I don't know where. That's all where I get it, but it's real fine. You have to keep it watered. The water just runs right through it, so you have to make sure, you know, when you're propagating, if you're not setting them in a bucket of water, then you got to keep them watered wherever they're at. If you use the BM1 especially, because it goes right through. Sometimes you have to set them in the water so it actually has time for it to soak up into the BM1.
But then when you do, if you want it to drain out, right?
You want it to drain out, yeah. If you're planting them in the dirt, yeah. But you want to keep them moist. You know, you don't
But just
want.
not soggy.
Yeah, the dirt is a different animal than doing them in a bucket of water.
Yeah.
So, but you want to keep them moist. You don't want to let them dry out because those roots are very, very small and very tender. If you've ever done like a sweet potato and see the little roots in a sweet potato in a jar, the angel trumpets are a little bit bigger than that, but that just looks like a ball of spaghetti at the bottom. So when you plant them, you have to be real careful that you don't damage those roots. So I don't pack it down. I don't pack that BMW down. I let the water, usually I have some kind of feed trough or something on the cows, and I'll fill it up with water and just sit the plants that I'm planting in there, pour a little water on top to make sure, and then let them sit there for a day where they soak up that water from the bottom.
David, I cut mine in the strips, but some of them have leaves I didn't strip. Is it too late to go back and strip them
No,
off?
never too late. Angel trumpets and Confederate roses especially are really forgiving, pretty forgiving. I did leave a few little pretty leaves at the top on mine. The bigger stalks had some leaves that came out.
They were just, yeah, I know.
Yeah, small leaves, you know, like these branches that had a bunch, I cut them off. Most of mine are just sticks.
Okay.
But you do it before the freeze. Once the freeze comes, You may think you're gonna do it. I did go out to I was out there at, I don't know when it was, when it dawned on me that I had not cut the Confederate rose back. It was 10 o'clock and the cold front was coming in, it was freezing. So I was out there with a flashlight and the pruners, and my BVDs, cutting this Confederate rose down just so I had enough to do it. And then I went back a couple days later after we'd had a couple freezes and cut some. And when I cut it, I could tell the tissues were very, they just kind of ripped instead of cutting. So I kind of concluded that those were probably not going to do well. Though I did go ahead and put them in water and mark them just to see if they would do well. But, and the angel trumpet's the same way. Once it freezes, that ball game's usually over. Once it freezes and you got some Salem, I would start, just cut it at the ground, forget about trying to root this stuff, but save that mother plant and they'll come back, usually the next year. Very few of mine have not come back. Even with the big freeze last year, almost all of mine came back if I did it properly. And I guess, you know, a lot of people ask me about different woody vines and trees and stuff like that. These are the only ones I really mess with. I imagine you could do it with a lot of woody vine plants. You get into fruit trees and everything, and she does air laying, and that's where you want to get into a whole different world of propagating. But she has a video on air laying, but that's a whole different animal. Mine's very simple. Success rate's real high. So that's the main thing. I had a variegated this year. I swore I would not do it. I would not cut these back. One year I had like 20 buckets in the pump house of, 15 to 20 cuttings a piece. I had angel trumpets everywhere. This year I had variegated. I had 2 variegated, which is a little bit rare, especially for me. So I made sure they were in pots. So I wasn't sure if the pots were going to freeze. They weren't in the ground, so I went on and harvested those. So, any questions on propagating a few of the types we're talking about?
All right, well, thank you.